Hi, my name is Matt Thompson, and I'm making this video today about some dangerous trends that we're seeing in the cattle industry in the United States of America. And I'm making this not only for my fellow cattle producers, but also consumers, and really in all people in all productive industries that are facing similar type challenges. Because I think if these trends cannot be reversed, we are facing something that's going to have a devastating impact on all of our society. I mean, history has told us that. These trends, these things that we're seeing today, have got to be reversed. And I believe we're seeing a situation where we're constantly having these forums and commissions and councils are getting together with academic types and bankers and various things, and they sit around and they figure out plans of how everything is going to work and who's going to do what. And I think it's really in total without regard to what happens in the real world. It's like it's in its own little world, but yet these things are having an effect on all of our productive capacity. And a nation's wealth is simply the sum of what we can produce. And it's becoming more and more impossible to produce. And I think it's important as we look at these issues to tell the individual stories. So this video is really in three parts. I'm going to tell the personal story of our feedlot development in Western Australia. I'm going to talk about private property rights from a historical perspective. And finally, I'm going to look at the current state of affairs in the United States, really the things that have happened in this last year and the direction that we're heading. This is a picture of my wife and I, just a little bit about myself. We were married in 1997, and this picture was from 2001. And I had worked ever since I graduated from college at Texas A&M in the cattle feeding industry in one way or the other. Lived in Amarillo, Texas at the time, and had really worked in all areas of the cattle feeding industry. My wife Janet came from a really good, solid ranching family that also fed cattle in various feedlots, knew a lot about the industry. And in 2001, we really wanted to get into owning our own feedlot. And, it was very difficult to do in the United States at the time because it had already been built and required a tremendous amount of capital to get started. So I was talking to a friend of mine in Australia that said cattle feeding's really taking off in Australia, and you ought to come have a look. And I did, and really liked what I saw down there at the time. And we found a location close to a town called Narrogin in Western Australia. It's about 2 hours from the West Australian city of Perth, one of the beautiful cities of the world. And we found there in Western Australia a lot of things that really appealed to us from the point of view of setting up a cattle feedlot. There was a lot of high quality cattle there, and there was a tremendous amount of grain production. And virtually all of the grain at the time was being exported to Asia and also to the United States of America. And I thought it just made sense to get the two things together, to get the cattle and the feed together and to produce beef in Australia that could then be exported to the high-end markets in Japan and Korea, China, and other developing markets. And so we looked for a location, and we found an ideal location for setting up a feedlot, we thought, in Narrogin, near Narrogin, Western Australia. For cattle feeding, you really need an area that's semi-arid, doesn't have a lot of moisture, but yet has a lot of grain production. And that was certainly the case there. We found good, firm soils. We found a location where we had access to three-phase power, good water. There were excellent winds to keep the cattle cool. And so we thought we had the perfect location there. And it was right next door to a piggery, a large piggery. And so we began the process to get all of our approvals. Very rigorous process to get approved. You have to prove that you're going to contain all of your effluent, and it's very difficult to achieve. And it was supposed to take 4 months. It ended up taking 2 years, and we were almost broke by the time we got through it, but we were able to get started. And part of the approvals process was not only to show that we had the environmental engineering in place, but also they had open forum meetings with the local government where we presented our proposal to the community, and they had a chance to think about it before they approved it. They asked for submissions, and I think, from the start there was a small group of detractors, and but the large majority supported us. When they asked for submissions, there was 2 submissions against the proposal and 28 in favor, and so we went ahead and we built. I've done a lot of work in the United States with Temple Grandin, Bud Williams, and others about low stress stock handling. And, I'd seen how a lot of the facilities in North America and worked in a lot of the facilities. And so this was our chance to kind of fix things and do things better than it had ever been done before, and to learn from experience. And this is the site we found. You can see the slopes were ideal for what we were trying to achieve. And after 2 years, we finally got started. And that's a slip form concrete machine we didn't actually own, but all of the rest of the work we did completely in-house. We hired our own people, and we did all of the construction, all of the plumbing, everything we built ourselves. And we built as we grew. We started out small, and we were building and operating at the same time. And this is a picture of our second daughter, Abby. 3 of our 4 children were born in the Narragansett community, and we loved living there. We loved the culture. We loved the people. And like I say, I think in anything you do, there's always a small group of detractors, but the vast majority of the people were really good to us and supported us, and we had a good life there. We loved living there. And this is a sign out front of our business. And as we began to hire people, one of the early hires that we had was a guy named Lindley Bosley. And Lindley is the one second to the left, standing next to me there. And Lindley, when he was a very young boy, he grew up on a farm, and then his dad had passed away, and they lost the farm, and he ended up doing various contract jobs. He was shearing sheep when we found him, and I think others just sort of saw him as a laborer. But when I saw Lindley working, it didn't take me long to figure out that this guy was nearly a genius in my mind. And he was entirely self-taught, but he could figure out how to engineer anything, and really an amazing person. And so I had a lot of ideas from all my experience with the North American feedlotting industry. I'd also toured, South African facilities and Mexican facilities. So, I had a lot of ideas about how these things should be built. And Lindley was able to take those ideas and make it happen. And this is a picture of a commodity shed that he built, everything on the inside and helped construct. This was an office that he helped get put together and set up for us. And we built, everything, like I say, using Temple's and Bud's designs so that cattle could be handled easily in a low-stress manner. It was really important to us to keep the cattle calm for what we were doing. And so we used all those techniques, and we really wanted to do things better than it had ever been done before, from an animal welfare perspective and also an environmental perspective. So we started small. We started actually with 1,000 head, and it was a struggle at first, proving that this type of thing would work in the area that it was. And but after 4 or 5 years, things really started coming together for us, and we were able to really open up markets into Japan and Korea that hadn't been accessed from Western Australia before at that kind of a level. And things were really going well for us from a business point of view. Like I said, we had approval for a 15,000 head, which is not that big by U.S. standards, but it was huge for over there at the time. And we built up to the point where we had about 25 full-time employees. We had an annual revenue well over $10 million. and our export markets were growing, and our employees were well paid, and things were going well for us. And this was a picture of some Asian buyers who were coming into our facility to have a look, and they really liked what they saw and what they were getting from us. And it was about that time that I had become the president of the Cattle Feeding Association in Western Australia. And it was about that time that they came up with this national pollutant inventory system. Here's a look at that today. And this was a system to require all industries to report certain levels of pollution. And there was a threat of a $25,000 a day fine if you didn't comply. You were simply to take the number of cattle for the cattle feeding industry. We were to take the number of head of cattle that we had, multiply by a certain number per head that they gave us, dictated to us, write the answer down, and sign that we were polluting with so many tons of ammonia a year. And, in cattle feeding, we've done a tremendous lot of work on nutrition and the science behind it. There's a lot that goes into it. We have all kinds of different rations for different things, and we're constantly testing the rations that we're feeding the cattle to make sure we're exactly spot on in what we're calculating as far as the energy levels and the protein levels. We have it all on computer. We measure each pen of cattle every day, what they consume. So we knew exactly how much nitrogen the cattle were eating on a daily basis. And I got to looking at the number that they were asking us to report. And I said, where does this formula come from? Where does this number by the head of ammonia emissions come from? And they couldn't tell me. They referred to some graduate student paper in Iowa State in the United States. And then they said, no, that wasn't right. And I finally figured out that what they had done to come up with the number for the amount of ammonia cattle produce on a daily basis was they knew what the trigger was in the National Pollutant Inventory reporting requirement. And they simply reverse engineered it. They decided that they wanted to regulate anybody that had more than 100 head of cattle. So that's where they came up with the number of how much ammonia that the cattle were emitting. And the number that they required us to report was physiologically impossible. It meant that the cattle were emitting way, way more nitrogen than what they were consuming on a daily basis. So this was sort of the beginning of my awakening. And I learned two things from this process. The first thing I learned was that all of the numbers that you see, emissions reporting for various industries around the world that you're told in the media and various things, all of those numbers are bogus. They're not based on real science. And the second thing that I really understood after this happened was, we really wanted to do things right. We wanted to do things right by the environment. We wanted to understand what we were doing. And in working with these people with the National Pollutant Inventory, they couldn't care less what the real number was. They did not care what ammonia emissions really were. They weren't interested in that. The only thing they cared about was regulating anybody with more than 100 head of cattle. And so it wasn't too long after that that the bureaucracy in Australia began setting the tables to have a carbon tax. And this was long before any legislature in Australia had ever even considered the carbon tax. But the bureaucracy was running the show, and they were already making plans to implement it. And they held a forum for members of all industry in Western Australia, an open forum public meeting for the oil and gas industry, the mining industry. I went as a representative of the cattle feeding industry, but all major productive industries were at that meeting, open forum public meeting. And at that meeting, I passed out copies of this Great Global Warming Swindle DVD, which was kind of newly released and hardly seen in Australia at the time. But in that video, there's some really solid scientists in there that were disputing the entire theory of greenhouse gas anthropogenic global warming that they were using to try to tax us. And I didn't expect, when I raised this issue at the meeting, that all of the regulators and bureaucrats in the room would suddenly agree with me. But I did expect that at an open forum meeting, I would be allowed to raise an alternative point of view without being retaliated against. But it wasn't 2 weeks after that the Department of Environment showed up at the feedlot, literally with sirens on their cars. And they said it was an environmental emergency. And they began a process of attacking us and restricting our license to make it impossible for us to operate. And there was an organization called EDO, or Environmental Defender's Office, has a sister organization in the United States called EDF, Environmental Defenders Fund, and they practice the same extortion tactics. And so we began a legal process. They decided that they were going to severely restrict our license, and so they said that although we had been operating for 5 years, we had all kinds of detailed records about inflows and outflows, how our retention pond was working. Retention pond had never been more than half full at any time. And they suddenly decided that it needed to be 6 times larger than it was, something that would have cost many $100,000 to make it comply with the environmental regulations. And when we originally started, we were approved that we were more than 100 meters of a waterway. They suddenly decided that we were within 100 meters of a waterway, therefore needed more restrictive regulation. And they restricted our throughput in the feedlot. Although we had spent the money to build up to 10,000 head, we had a permit to get up to 15,000. They suddenly restricted our license to where we couldn't have more than 6,000 on any given day, which meant that really we couldn't keep more than about 4,500 in order to achieve that 6,000 head on any given day. And it really crippled us as far as from a cash flow point of view. And another thing they put on our license was a requirement that there were no complaints on our facility. So imagine that setup for any grocery store, any bank, any government office. What if you had to prove by the end of the year that there were no complaints against your business, and if there was one complaint, you would have to shut down after spending millions of dollars to produce to build the facility. And it was an impossible standard, and it was intentionally impossible. And so we began the process of taking legal action in response. We were told that one of the best property rights and environmental lawyers in Perth was a guy named Johannes Schumi. You see him pictured there. And so we went to visit Mr. Schumi, and we spent about an hour with him. And he told us that although we had an original approval for 15,000 head, it didn't mean anything. We didn't have any rights. We needed to go back to the Department of Environment and do whatever they told us to do. And he charged us for $4,500 for that consultation. And we found out 6 months later that Johannes Schumbe was the convener of EDO. He was the one that had organized the two people that had complained about our facility from the start into this organization to gum up the works and make it look official. And he never disclosed to us that he had been working for the whole side, for the other side the whole time. And that's kind of the type of things that go on with these policies. This is me at our retention pond that they said needed to be 6 times bigger in the middle of the wet season. And, the thing was completely and totally over-engineered. We had proved up taking soil samples all through the bottom of that thing and proved up through falling head permeability tests that it was less permeable than 1 times 10 to the minus 10th. In other words, not even a millimeter could ever seep through there. And, there was no potable water underneath there anyway. It was all saline water table. So everything was just totally over-engineered. But yet, after we criticized the global warming mantra, they found it all to be totally inadequate. This is where they claimed that we were within 100 meters of the waterway suddenly 6 years after we were approved. This is me standing in the middle of that waterway in the middle of the wet season. And when we objected, we called, there was an appeals process that supposedly you can appeal any decision by the department. We took the appeals convener to that place that I'm standing right there and said, look, this is not a waterway. And the appeals convener said, well, if the Department of Environment says it's a waterway, then it's a waterway. And so this is how they strangled us to death. A business that was running full bore, earning over $10 million a year at 25 full-time employees, was suddenly rendered worthless in a period of months. The facility couldn't be sold because nobody would want to buy it with those kind of impossible conditions on the license. And so we had to lay off all of our employees, which was very difficult to me. We were always the type that paid our employees very well and considered them to be family. Lindley had taken other just temporary jobs with the idea in contract work, anything he could do in the meantime, with the idea that when we got this license issue resolved that he would come back to us. And we were issued our new license, which was worse than all the rest. And I think it made Lindley understand that, the operation would never get going again, and all the work that he had done would have been gone to waste. And March of 2010, Lindley committed suicide. And so we tried to go on from there and fight on in court, and they were always changing venues and always running up court costs for insignificant stuff that didn't even matter, and preventing us from getting the main body of our case to the court. And in the end, they required that we would indemnify the court for all the costs of the government if they wanted to hire 20 lawyers, and it took 3 years to get this case to court. We had to prove that we had the funds available to pay all the state's court costs for as many of the high-priced lawyers in the world that they wanted to pay to come fight this. And, of course, we didn't have the assets because they had stolen them from us. And so the dream, although it briefly did come to fruition, died on the vine. And we eventually moved back to our home country of the United States. And life goes on. And we still have our family, and we just move on. And I've worked managing feedlots and stuff back in the States since then. But I think when this first happened to us in Australia, in the back of our minds, we were thinking if we were back in the United States, this would never happen. And I think we were very disappointed when we got back to the United States and we saw that this kind of thing is happening all over the place at an ever-increasing rate. And so I think it's important to take a historical perspective and look at what happens when private property rights are not protected. And I think in this country, our founding fathers, the basic question that we need to ask behind all of these things that happen: does the government exist to protect the rights and liberties of the individual, or does the individual exist for the benefit and protection of the government? And, in the United States, our founders were clear and unequivocal that the governments only had a limited role, and that was to protect the rights and liberties of the individual. Because they said that our rights did not come from them, but rather that we were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And in order to protect these natural, God-given rights, governments were instituted amongst men, drawing their just powers from us. not only did our founding fathers say this, but history has rendered an unequivocal answer to this question of how society should be organized. Should the individual serve the state, or vice versa? It's now more than 800 years since private property rights were first codified into English law in the Magna Carta of 1215. And long, long before that, we're told that we're told that Moses came down from the mountain with a tablet. And that tablet contained, amongst other things, that timeless four-word affirmation of the importance of individual property rights in a civil society. Thou shalt not steal. For me, the most glaring contrast between the ideals of individualism and collectivism can be found in the story of the Plymouth Pilgrims that migrated to the new continent in 1620. And our government schools do a good job of telling about how this all came to be, how the Pilgrims sailed from England on a ship called the Mayflower and arrived in New Plymouth in the New World in what's now Massachusetts in the year 1620. But they almost always omit the most important part of this story. You see, because the Plymouth Pilgrims established here on the new continent the very ideal that many in government departments and politics seem to be striving for today. They formed a purely 100% socialistic democracy. They signed a pact. It was called the Mayflower Compact, and it called for democratic election of governor, but it held that there would be all goods produced in the New World would be held in common for the good of the whole, and that there would be no private property in the New World. After over 2 years of this, half of the colonists were dead. They died of disease and starvation, including the original governor, Carver. And it was then that the newly elected governor, William Bradford, realized that all of the supplies that they had brought over from England were running out, and yet another unproductive summer would have undoubtedly led to the starvation of the entire colony the following winter. Governor Bradford later wrote about this period in his memoirs of Plymouth Plantation. And Governor Bradford said, "The failure of this experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years, and by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients, applauded by some of later times, that the taking away of private property and the possession of it in a community by a commonwealth would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent, and retard much employment which would have otherwise been to the general benefit and comfort." And so it was in 1623 that Governor Bradford first established private property rights in the New World. Not surprisingly, in that first year of private property rights, the colonists enjoyed their first bountiful harvest, and they celebrated with a great feast, which is still celebrated across North America today and now known as Thanksgiving. And among the colonists that were celebrating that day was my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Stephen Hopkins. And the rest, as they say, is history. The colonists that raided corn traded with others that built cabins and wagons and farming tools, and others that traded for beaver pelt with Indians, and on and on and on, until we see today that this land, the land on which these 30 remaining survivors of the Mayflower were literally starving to death in a socialistic collective, this land now comfortably feeds over 300 million people and exports food all over the world. It's a shining example of the tremendous improvement in standard of living that can occur when private property rights are protected. But unfortunately, more recent history shows what happens when societies go the other way, when they answer the basic question in the wrong way, when they decide that the individual exists to serve the state rather than the other way around. In 1932, Joseph Stalin decided that Ukrainian farmers were not participating fully in the communist revolution and that they were hoarding too much of the grain that they produced. So he sent commissars into the Ukraine, to forcibly remove at gunpoint every single kernel of grain from the people that had produced it and ship it to Moscow and ship it for export. What followed was a tragedy most historians now believe greater than the Holocaust. This was from a periodical at the time said 6 million died. They're now estimating more like 10 or 11 million died in the man-made famine, what's now known as the Holodomor. In the 1950s in communist China, Mao Zedong nationalized all private property, took over all agricultural production, and organized all production into collectives with centralized command and control of those collectives. What followed was what I believe to be was the greatest calamity in human history. It's now estimated that 35 million people died in the Chinese famines, 1959, 1960. Yet scarcely even mentioned in our textbooks today because I think they don't want people to know the cause of it. We all know what happened in the 1930s in Germany when the National Socialist Party decided that the good of the whole was more important than the rights of the individual. As I'm speaking today, years of centralized control in the once productive country of Venezuela, first by the communist dictator Hugo Chavez, more recently by Maduro, has rendered the country totally helpless. The government can no longer afford to pick up the trash, and that's a good thing because that's all some people have to eat. The lessons of history are absolutely clear. Centralized command and control always leads to disaster. It always has, and it always will. And people say that it can't happen here, but it will happen here if we follow the same policies that have always caused these disasters to happen in the past. And when you look across in America today, you find people in all walks of life are drowning in a sea of red tape. They suffer from that sickening humanity-killing feeling that their own government does not trust them to think for themselves, but rather expects them to act like some cog in a machine, unthinkingly punching out the next rivet. Ronald Reagan once said, "This is a democracy. And if none of us can be trusted to manage our own affairs, then who among us can be trusted to manage everyone else's affairs?" But unfortunately, we see today that every year enormous piles of new legislation is passed. New legislation that gives more government control. And the legislation that's passed almost always contains now what's called Henry VIII clauses, named after the infamous English tyrant Henry VIII. These are clauses inserted into legislation that after the enabling legislation is passed, render the king or the bureaucrat capable of writing their own laws in the future. Agencies and federal departments, local governments are acting in concert with the agenda of the United Nations and reporting in some cases directly to the United Nations. United Nations has never been a friend of private property rights. This is from 1976. They said land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals and subject to the pressures and inefficiencies of the market. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth, therefore contributes to social injustice. So they've always been opposed to private property. And agencies and departments and bureaucracies all across the western United States, all across all of the United States, are making rules based on the precautionary principle, which was authored by the United Nations. And the precautionary principle, for those that don't know, basically turns the English common law principle of presumption of innocence on its head. The precautionary principle says that government agents are justified in implementing any kind of restriction on land use, on private property land use, any kind of restriction, on merely the allegation of environmental harm. They needn't have any proof of environmental harm. They needn't have any evidence whatsoever. Merely the allegation. We are all guilty until being proven innocent. And I'm going to concentrate now on what's going on with these NGOs. And I think most people understand that something's up, but probably haven't seen the full impact. and how these NGOs are creating quasi-government structures that really centrally control all aspects of our production. And when they control all aspects of production, they control our society. And that's our goal. So we're going to look extensively at the work of Jason Clay, who's with the World Wildlife Fund, and we're going to talk about them in detail. This is from their main website, and I wanted to show this quickly because it's indicative of the kind of nonsensical pseudoscience numbers and stuff they always quote to justify all of their efforts to take control of our society. And if you look at the second paragraph there, it says today 7.3 billion people consume 1.6 times what the Earth's natural resources can supply. Okay, so I'd like to see the data for that study where they made that conclusion. We're consuming 1.6 times what we have. And this is the kind of mindless nonsense that's behind most of the stuff that they do. Now, I want to take a look at Jason Clay speaking in 2010, because I think in this talk he really outlines what he's going to do to us and how he's going to get control over all the productive agencies and anything productive of the 15 major commodity groups globally they want to get control of.
I grew up on a small farm in Missouri. We lived on less than $1 a day for about 15 years. I got a scholarship, went to university.
All right, I hate to interrupt him so soon, but I want people to understand what he does. So he says he grew up on a small farm where they brought in less than $1 a day. I mean, does this guy sound like a small farmer to you? I mean, has he ever... Farming doesn't work that way, does it? What was diesel fuel back then? I mean, you don't get paid like that. And you know, I grew up on a small farm in Missouri. When I hear a farmer talk, they say, oh, well, we used to raise Herefords and then we got into Simmentals, or, you know, we raised beans and hogs back then, or, you know, is this guy really a farmer? I don't think so.
Studied international agriculture, studied anthropology, and decided I was going to give back. I was going to work with small farmers. I was going to help alleviate poverty. I was going to work on international development. And then I took a turn and ended up here. Now, if you get a PhD and you decide not to teach, you don't always end up in a place like this. It's a choice. You might end up driving a taxi cab. You could be in New York. What I found was I started working with refugees and famine victims, small farmers, all, or nearly all, who had been dispossessed and displaced. Now, what I'd been trained to do was methodological research on such people. So I did it. I found out how many women had been raped en route to these camps. I found out how many people had been put in jail, how many family members had been killed. I assessed how long they were going to stay and how much it would take to feed them. And I got really good at predicting how many body bags you would need for the people who were going to die in these camps. Now, this is God's work, but it's not my work. It's not the work I set out.
Okay, so Jason says that his work is not God's work, and I'm certainly inclined to agree with him. But you think about what he said there, and, you know, he's speaking in hyperbole, isn't he? I mean, he's talking about his job was to count the body bags. I mean, the people in that village don't bury their dead in body bags. You know, he's talking nonsense. Now, I'd like to let Jason run for about 6 minutes here, and this is where he really describes how he's going to take over all production across the world and become the world's dictator. And there's 3 things I'd like you to listen for here. First of all, his use of the word we is all through this. We this, we that. And I'd like you to think about that, we. Who is this we he is referring to? Does this man have a mouse in his pocket? And secondly, I'd like you to pay attention to that funnel-shaped chokehold that is going to allow him to get control over all avenues of production. And finally, I'd like you to pay particular attention to what happens with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, because I think we can learn a lot about what happened with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. So here we go.
These are the places that are the richest in biodiversity and the most important from an ecosystem function point of view. We have to work in these places. We have to save these places if we want a chance in hell of preserving biodiversity as we know it. We looked at the threats to these places. These are the 15 commodities that fundamentally pose the biggest threats to these places because of deforestation, soil loss, water use, pesticide use, overfishing, etc. So we've got 35 places. We've got 15 priority commodities. Who do we work with to change the way those commodities are produced? Are we going to work with 6.9 billion consumers? Let's see, that's about 7,000 languages, 350 major languages. A lot of work there. I don't see anybody actually being able to do that very effectively. Are we going to work with 1.5 billion producers? Again, a daunting task. There must be a better way. 300 to 500 companies control 70% or more of the trade of each of the 15 commodities that we've identified as the most significant. If we work with those, if we change those companies in the way they do business, then the rest will happen automatically. So, we went through our 15 commodities. This is 9 of them. We lined them up side by side, and we put the names of the companies that work on each of those. And if you go through the first 25 or 30 names of each of the commodities, what you begin to see is, gosh, there's Cargill here, there's Cargill there, there's Cargill everywhere. In fact, these names start coming up over and over again. So we did the analysis again a slightly different way. We said, if we take the top 100 companies, what percentage of all 15 commodities do they touch, buy or sell? And what we found is it's 25%. So 100 companies control 25% of the trade of all 15 of the most significant commodities on the planet. We can get our arms around 100 companies. 100 companies we can work with. Why is 25% important? Because if these companies demand sustainable products, they'll pull 40 to 50% of production. Companies can push producers faster than consumers can. By companies asking for this, we can leverage production so much faster than by waiting for consumers to do it. After 40 years, the global organic movement has achieved 0.7 of 1% of global food. We can't wait that long. We don't have that kind of time. We need change that's going to accelerate. Even working with individual companies is not probably going to get us there. We need to begin to work with industries. So we've started roundtables where we bring together the entire value chain, from producers all the way to the retailers and brands. We bring in civil society, we bring in NGOs, we bring in researchers and scientists to have an informed discussion, sometimes a battle royale, to figure out what are the key impacts of these products, what is the global benchmark, what's an acceptable impact, and design standards around that. It's not all fun and games. In salmon aquaculture, we kicked off a roundtable almost 6 years ago. 8 entities came to the table. We eventually got, I think, 60% of production, global production at the table, and 25% of demand at the table. 3 of the original 8 entities were suing each other. And yet, next week, we launch globally verified, vetted, and certified standards for salmon aquaculture. It can happen. So what brings the different entities to the table? It's risk and demand. For the big companies, it's reputational risk, but more importantly, they don't care what the price of commodities is. If they don't have commodities, they don't have a business. They care about availability. So the big risk for them is not having product at all. For the producers, if a buyer wants to buy something produced a certain way, that's what brings them to the table. So it's the demand that brings them to the table. The good news is we identified 100 companies 2 years ago. In the last 18 months, we've signed agreements with 40 of those 100 companies to begin to work with them on their supply chain. And in the next 18 months, we've signed up to work with another 40, and we think we'll get those signed as well. Now what we're doing is bringing the CEOs of these 80 companies together to help twist the arms of the final 20 to bring them to the table, because they don't like NGOs, they've never worked with NGOs, they're concerned about this, they're concerned about that, but we all need to be in this together. So we're pulling out all the stops. We're using whatever leverage we have to bring them to the table. One company we're working with that's begun in baby steps perhaps, but has begun this journey on sustainability is Cargill. They've funded research that shows that we can double global palm oil production without cutting a single tree in the next 20 years, and do it all in Borneo alone by planting on land that's already degraded. The study shows that the highest net present value for palm oil is on land that's been degraded. They're also undertaking a study to look at all of their supplies of palm oil to see if they could be certified and what they would need to change in order to become third-party certified under a credible certification program. Why is Cargill?
Okay. So did everyone hear what he said there regarding the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil? I mean, first of all, he's talking about Borneo. Borneo is an island to the north of Australia. It's kind of a third world type of a place. But notice what he said happened there. Remember at the start, he said he supported small farmers and he was for small farmers. And, so the natives of Borneo, their land was declared degraded. And when it was declared degraded, they could no longer access supply chains that were controlled by the World Wildlife Federation. And then Cargill gets a hold of the land. And Cargill pays World Wildlife Fund researchers to do research, and voila, the researchers say that if Cargill produces palm oil on this land, that it'll be sustainable. It's like magic. And so do you see what's happening with this stuff, people? This is very indicative of what's going on here. And when you look at these round tables, this is from the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which is our organization compliant with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. I'm sure some of you watching this are in different industries, but I imagine there's something similar in your industry. And I want to look at some things. This is a framework that was issued just recently from the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Remember that this roundtable is supported by all levy-funded beef organizations. They are going straight down the sustainability track. They've supported it. They've funded World Wildlife Fund to do these things. We have it in writing. We know they did. And imagine 20 years ago if the farming industry organization had agreed with the government to declare that dust was pollution. But that's exactly what they've just done. If you look down at the third one, at air emissions, it says the cumulative emissions of pollutants, including greenhouse gas emissions, ammonia, particulate matter, and odors from a sector for each process. So these are things, when you think about these things, think about 300 years ago, before Europeans came to America. If you looked out across the American landscape then, you would have found lots of dry particulate matter, lots of odors, lots of ammonia, lots of methane emissions, and lots of carbon dioxide emissions. These are not pollutants. Pollutants are something that's toxic. Yet they've just declared dust amongst all these other things pollutants. And when they declare dust as a pollutant, they know that no activity could occur in a rural environment if you couldn't create dust. You can't drive down the road. All activity would have to stop. So they don't intend to stop all activity at once, but they intend to declare it bad. And then so that with selective enforcement, they can decide who they're going to attack and who they're not. And this is how they end free speech. They declare dry particulate matter as pollution. They know that everyone has to cause dust in order to produce anything, and then they can decide who produces and who doesn't. The same thing if you look at their standard on animal well-being. It says the cumulative effects of cattle health, care, comfort, and well-being. Intentionally very vaguely worded. So if you speak out against the system, or you try to market product on the outside of the system, or you say one thing against the World Wildlife Fund, I can promise you that you will be found in violation of comfort and well-being of your livestock. Now I want to watch a little bit more video of Jason. I think this one is actually from 2017. But notice how he's changed a little bit from the 2010 one as far as his goals go.
If we don't get where and how we produce food right, we can turn out the lights and go home. So that's kind of where we're headed with this. Everybody who cares about how a product is produced usually cares about it because of the big impacts. And the big impacts don't come from the better producers. They come from the worse producers. So the tool that we invented actually rewards the better producers, but it doesn't actually change the rest. And so what we've decided now is that we really need to focus on the bottom. We've got to move the bottom. And if the bottom 25% of producers of any commodity cause about 50% of the impacts and produce about 10% of the product. So if we want to double production, you focus on the bottom, not the top. If you want to reduce environmental impact, you focus on the bottom, not the top. The other thing that's backing us up now, though, is that we're beginning to do the kind of business case analyses of producers that are certified versus producers that aren't. And what we're finding is that certified producers are more efficient and they make more money. They don't necessarily produce more, but they have higher net profits.
Okay, so yeah, there's a whole lot in that 1 minute thing right there. Did you notice the bogus statistics said 25% of the producers cause 50% of the damage they've determined? They just pull this stuff out of thin air. I mean, what damage? What damage are they talking? They've got no evidence to support any of this. But I hope that all cattle producers will think about what he just said, that he's going to take 25% of you out. And furthermore, I think in order to really understand what's wrong with this, we need to think in terms of our founding fathers and get back into that paradigm that they taught us to think in. That we all have a natural God-given right to own property. We have a right to decide how that property is managed. And we are innocent until proven guilty of any violation against us. And what would you think if you turned on the television in your local community news tomorrow and the local sheriff was on there and he said, okay, in 2020, in our community, we're going to arrest 297 people for murder next year. How do they know? How does Jason Clay know? They haven't done any audits. They haven't even defined what the environmental crime is. And they have already decided they're going to take 25% of you out. I mean, this stuff is crazy. Crazy. But that's what's going on. So, yeah, let me go back to that Jason Clay video, because there's one more thing I want you to catch here. And I want for everyone to see this next thing that he's going to say, because I think this is really important. Listen carefully.
One of our strategies has always been to take choice away from consumers. I know that sounds odd, but basically our point is that consumers shouldn't have a choice about sustainability. All the choices on the shelf should be sustainable. And the way to do that is to get the company.
Okay? Did everyone hear that? Because what have all these industry associations and everybody told us? That the reason that we have to go down this track and do all this sustainability stuff and do audits for the World Wildlife Fund, what is the reason that they tell us that we have to do that? because consumers are demanding it, isn't it? That's what they say every time. Consumers are demanding it. Well, it's not true, is it? Consumers aren't demanding it. He just said so. Who is demanding it? Jason Clay and that mouse in his pocket. So just a summary of what's going on with these WWF roundtables. And make no mistake, all of these roundtables are controlled by WWF and the Windsor family. So they want to remove consumer choice. They want to restrain uncertified producers from the marketplace. They want to define natural, necessary, and non-harmful aspects of production as pollution. And they want to remove freedom of speech. And this is sometimes a hard one for people to understand, and that's the reason I wanted to tell our personal story of our feedlot development in Australia. But I think you can see with dry particulate matter and other things like this, the goal is the removal of freedom of speech. Because when they make it so difficult that nobody could possibly comply with anything, then they have selective enforcement, and they enforce against those who speak against the system. So, talking with some friends about what we could do in response to this, we came up with the Productive American Coalition for Truth. It's a 501c3 nonprofit that we have founded and are getting off the ground at the moment. And the mission of the Productive American Coalition for Truth is to promote sound decision making in the use of natural resources by supporting producer rights, verifying product integrity, and supporting consumer choice. We want consumers to have a choice. We do we will be operating producer verification programs, but we never dictate. We only validate. So if a producer wants to say that has a way of selling beef, and he can prove to us that it's 100% raised in America and not mixed with any foreign product when it's sold, that's something that is verifiable. We can take a look and certify that, put our stamp on it, and validate it. Okay, we can have certified grass-fed, certified grain-fed, anything that is objective that we can verify, we can validate. So PAC then serves as a handshake between producer and consumer. We merely verify the process that the producer wants to claim. We never dictate to the consumer. We never dictate to the producer. We're merely a handshake. And so further understanding of how our goals and definitions differ from the WWF people who have now aligned themselves with NCBA. Sustainability, the original definition of sustainability was the ability to be maintained at a certain level. But this word has been so co-opted and so used out of context in its modern usage. Sustainability really means any production that's controlled by tyrants. So at the PACT, we'll never verify any claim of sustainability. It's not verifiable, it's not objective, and that's not our business. And a stakeholder, you hear the UN, the WWF, and others often refer to stakeholders, and by stakeholder they mean anybody that's interested in an operation. At PACT, a stakeholder is somebody that owns a percentage of the farm. Pollutant, they refer to all kinds of natural elements as pollutants. At PACT, pollutant is something that is toxic. It's not dry particulate matter. It's not carbon dioxide, and it's not methane. So PACT is acting to promote absolute producer rights and absolute consumer choice. If you wish to donate and help PACT get off the ground, you can send money to this PayPal account, or you can send checks to the address listed below. So that's the conclusion of my presentation today. But I just say that we are at a crossroads, not only in the beef industry, but in all of our society. And it's time for us to decide. We can't have it both ways. Are we going to support individual rights and individual liberties? Or are we going to have centralized control? And if we're going to have individual rights and individual liberties, we need to rethink the money that we're sending to previously trusted organizations, to academic institutions, to producer organizations that are supporting centralized control and supporting the World Wildlife Fund. We need to decide. We're going to have to decide right now if this country is to survive. Are we going to support individual rights and liberty? Are we going to support centralized control? And it's my hope that you'll decide to support liberty. Thank you very much for your time.